That's everyone here. Craig, if you'd like to start, thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Well, good morning, good evening, and welcome to the University of the West of Scotland. If I can just remind people to use the chat function to pose questions, which I'll monitor and bring you in at appropriate times. We are recording this event, and as you can probably see, if you can see Jonathan on your screen at the moment, he is standing outside in the rain here at the University of the West of Scotland Paisley campus. So you join us today for the inaugural lecture from UWS Vice Principal and Pro Vice Chancellor for Learning, Teaching and Students, Professor Jonathan Powles. Like many nomadic Australians, Jonathan has an eclectic life and career, which all started after he was born into law-qualified parents in Sydney, Australia. Whilst he openly admits he's interested in almost everything, his academic background is in music. He studied composition with Peter Sculthorpe and Ross Edwards at the University of Sydney, before coming to the UK to complete a doctorate at Oxford, analysing the music of Igor Stravinsky, finishing in 1995. What was supposed to be a 3-year trip as an international student turned into an 11-year stay. Jonathan's first academic position was at Liverpool Hope University, and it was at Liverpool Hope in the 1990s where he first discovered a passion for teaching and learning that has formed the basis of his subsequent career. He returned to Australia in 2000 to the Australian National University, and after several roles there and subsequent roles in university leadership at the University of Canberra and then the University of New England in Armidale, he returned to the UK last year to take up the position of Vice Principal and Pro Vice Chancellor here at UWS. Now, whilst it's trying and unusual that we're holding these inaugural lectures online, as a lifelong advocate of the power of learning technology to connect people, Jonathan is delighted to be presenting in a format that reconnects him across place and time with people that have been part of his journey. Today, we welcome Jonathan's mother, his wife, friends, colleagues and former students from Oxford, Liverpool Hope, the Australian National University, Canberra University and the University of New England in Armidale, as well as new colleagues and students from UWS. And I understand there are several either existing or previous Vice Chancellors in the audience, and you're all very welcome. Jonathan is also a passionate amateur astronomer, and rather than us spend yet another hour trapped in the four walls of Zoom, Jonathan's going to try to use two pieces of learning technology, an iPhone and a Triumph motorcycle, to connect people, ideas, places, music and stars ranging from the Southern Hemisphere to right here in Paisley. And for those Australians here today, you can expect a little bit of Auntie Jack. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Powles for his inaugural lecture entitled Only Connect. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Craig. And look, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. I will start by repeating what you've just said, Craig. Look, we all thought that this would be different. We thought we'd be in a hall, that I'd be giving a more conventional lecture. And it's in one way really frustrating that we're not. You and I are tantalizingly close. Those of you who know where I am at UWS, where you are, Craig, will realize I'm just waving to your window and I can see you, but I don't know if the audience can. But you know, as someone who's been espousing the value of learning technology to connect people over the last 20 years, I see what's happening this morning and also what's been happening over the last year as a real challenge. Now it's time to walk the walk. And if indeed is the case that learning technology can actually provide the basis of a real human connection, then I think that will be something that the experience of the last 12 months will have proven or disproven. For me, it certainly has driven home the point that transmission of knowledge without human connection is actually missing the point of what learning is about. I think fundamentally that learning is a human activity, a connection with the other. It might be with another person sitting beside you, learning how to do a skill. It might be connecting with someone over 1,000 years of distance in time, connecting with a like-minded individual writing in a book. Fundamentally, at some level, learning is about connection. And that's why I've titled this lecture, Only Connect. But as well as connecting you with other people, learning technologies also free us up, particularly the modern digital technologies, free us up to be able to think about teaching and learning in a different way. And one of the things that's delighting me is that we've got people from all over the UK and from Australia and from right here in Scotland joining us as part of today's event. And what I'd like to do is to use some really simple technologies to connect you all with some stories and some places right here in Paisley over the next hour. And actually, in the spirit of connection, tease out some of these stories to show exactly how far they may travel. So with that, and I should say, some of what you're going to hear today is recorded. Some of what you're going to hear today is live. Hopefully you won't be able to work out which is which. The fact that in some shots it's going to be sunny, in some shots it's going to be raining, well, that's Scotland. But let's start now. If I could ask Rebecca to start the slideshow presentation, and we'll move on to mind location.
Only connect. This is a quote from Howard's End by E.M. Forster. The full quote is this: only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer. Only connect, and the beast and the monk, robbed of the isolation that is life to either, will die. The prose and the passion, the hermit and the beast, these metaphors, these opposites, I'm going to apply in a university context. STEM and the humanities, astronomy and music, knowledge and values. Forster is saying profoundly that understanding comes not from one or the other mode of being human, but from making a connection between them. Interestingly, Milan's talk, inaugural lecture last week, touched on similar themes, although Milan used swans as metaphor to illustrate his point, and I'm going to use a variety of other animals.
So university education is not about transmitting knowledge, and actually it never has been. It's about making connections. It's about connecting people and ideas. It's about connecting the academy with professions and industry. It's about connecting a vision of the present with what might be possible and different in the future. This isn't about knowledge. It might use knowledge as part of making those connections. And it's not actually about skills. Now, I've got a whole set of finely honed skills in Schenkerian prolongational analysis of 19th century music, or in the photometric reduction of binary star data to generate light curves. And neither of those skills are of any use whatsoever in doing my day job, which is to help run a university. I'd argue that this drive to make connections is a set of values and attitudes. And it's those values and attitudes that are the central mission of the university, to connect. I think these are vitally important attitudes, not just for doing our jobs, but for operating in the modern world. And I'd argue in the course of this lecture that we may, as universities, have just begun to lose sight of the importance of connection. Standing here in the middle of Paisley, one has a visceral and physical reminder that back in the 19th century, that confidence in connecting people and learning to change the world was stronger than it is today. Ahead of me, we have, behind the modern buildings of the University of Western Scotland, we've got the 19th century precursors, buildings variously known as the Paisley School of Art, the Paisley School of Design, the Paisley Technical College. If I pan around, we have just a huge reminder of the commitment people had to the power of the transformational power of learning. There's the what is now the Museum and Art Gallery, originally the Library and Museum, founded in the 1860s after the Public Library Act, the UK, by Peter Coates, and it was a gift to the people of Paisley to change the social structure through learning. My favourite, and we'll be spending some time up there, is the Coates Observatory, founded in 1883. Similarly, this is the oldest public observatory in Scotland, and it really was a very significant example of the connection of scientific learning in the public interest. One mustn't forget that at least for the philanthropic leaders in 19th century Paisley, religious faith was part of that conviction, part of that mission to change the world through learning. And in celebration of that, the Coates Memorial Church was built in the late 19th century, 1880s and 90s, to commemorate the work of Thomas Coates, one of the key philanthropists. But all around, everywhere I look, I'm reminded of a confidence of the ability to connect people and education. In the next 30 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is actually make some of those connections with you. I'd like to connect you with some of the locales here in Paisley that really demonstrate in their physical existence the connection between people and learning. I'd like to connect using two of my passion disciplines, music and astronomy. My mum would tell you, and she is in the audience today, that since I was a really young child, I've been fascinated in both stars and music. The first star I could name was apparently Alpha Centauri. It's actually, the Alpha Centauri system is the closest other star to our own sun, and it's the third brightest star in the sky, but people in Scotland will never have seen it because it's only visible from the southern hemisphere. Now, I'm not exploring Alpha Centauri. One of its near neighbours, conceptually and physically, RR Centauri, which behaves in some peculiar ways, and we're going to have a little bit of investigation as to why that is. Then over on the musical front, probably one of the first songs I learned, one of the first songs any Australian child learns, is Waltzing Matilda. You'll know it, it's the song we sing when we're beating you at rugby, Scotland. Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah. But actually, well, a bit like the star, there are at least two Waltzing Matildas, and when I discovered that as a young child, I got really frustrated. Which one is the real Waltzing Matilda? You can see there's a burgeoning musicologist even in the 6-year-old. So that's the question I want to answer today here in Paisley. Which one is the real Waltzing Matilda? But the star first. Let's explore some of the complexities of binary stars, but to do that, I need to take you up there to Powles Observatory.
I should probably say at this point that while a lot of this lecture is live on location, I have recorded some bits in advance. The bits that are actually on the motorbike and the bits where I'm actually playing the piano, for a couple of different reasons. I thought it was safest to make sure it worked beforehand. If you look up into the night sky, between 60 and 80% of the stars you see will actually be members of multiple star systems. They'll be binary stars with 2 members, or even triple or quadruple stars. Alpha Centauri, which I mentioned a moment ago, is probably the most famous of the double star systems. This is a Hubble Space Telescope picture of the 2 stars. Now, those stars are nice and wide apart. These 2 stars orbit each other about every 80 years. They're very close to Earth, so through a telescope you can see that there are 2. Most double stars don't fall into that category. The orbit of Alpha Centauri was first calculated by a Scottish astronomer, Alexander Roberts, as early as 1895, and Roberts is central to the story today. However, it's not Alpha Centauri that I'll be looking at. It's another star quite close by called RR Centauri. And Roberts was also one of the the earliest figures to look at the orbit and characteristics of RR Centauri. I'll tell you a little bit more about Alexander Roberts and the story of RR Centauri when I get off the bike. So here we are at the Thomas Coates Observatory, opened in 1883. Now, Alexander Roberts, who I was talking about on the ride up, took the first observations of the double star RR Centauri in 1894. I'd love to be able to tell you he took them from this building, but the star is only visible from the southern hemisphere. Let me tell you a bit about Roberts. He was a Scottish astronomer from the Highlands. He came and studied in Edinburgh at Moray College.
Teacher Training Institute. He was not trained as an astronomer, he was a school teacher. Perhaps one of the reasons I feel such a strong connection with him is he did all his astronomy in an essentially self-taught way. He thought about a career in astronomy, but was dissuaded from that as a career path, and instead emigrated to South Africa, where he became principal eventually of a school for native South Africans, but continued his astronomical observations as an amateur, guided and mentored by the South African Astronomer Royal, David Gill. Now, David Gill did have a connection with this building. He was one of the early advisors on the instrumentation that was appropriate to install in the observatory. So there is an actual connection there between Alexander Roberts and the Coates Observatory. But there is a connection that is more conceptual. There's something really striking about the intellectual confidence that leads to the installation of a disruptive social learning technology like the one behind me, and Roberts' confidence and enthusiasm to transcend his disciplinary boundaries as an educator and contribute to the world of science. And again, I think that confidence to connect is something that we may have lost. Well, let me tell you the story about Roberts and his observations, and let me show you a few charts. So, well, the star has therefore been quite well observed over the last 125 years since Roberts' first observations. I made the last observations of the star Centauri. Of course, my equipment is very different from Roberts. I've got computer-controlled cameras and computer-controlled timers. He was using visual estimation of the brightness of the stars and a mechanical chronometer. But it's amazing how robust his observations were, even after all these years. In 2005, some Chinese astronomers published a paper that really analysed all of the observations of the star. And what they were looking at is how long it took the star to revolve around, the two stars to revolve around each other. I said earlier 14.5 hours, but in fact what the Chinese astronomers, Yang et al., found, and you can see in this diagram illustrates that, is that the time that it's taking the stars to orbit each other, they surmise, has gradually increased. That's what the upward-facing parabola symbolises in this diagram, which is an observed minus computed plot of the period of the orbit. You can see Alexander Roberts' observations up there in a cluster in the top left corner. Now, the notion of the orbit getting gradually, milliseconds each year, but noticeably longer, this is not unusual for binary stars. They do evolve in terms of their structure, and we see this quite regularly, increase or decrease in orbits. Then I and some colleagues came along in 2016 and added another data set, and something quite interesting then happens. And this graph shows you what? Now, correcting the baseline, suddenly what we see when we factor in my own observation is that what looked like a regular increase in the period of the star in fact becomes a cyclic fluctuation. And this is quite unusual. There are a number of explanations, but the most likely explanation is that these two stars are in fact in a much longer orbit around something else in the system, some third body. The period of the new orbit is 49 years, and that means that whatever this object is, it's quite massive. The maths are quite simple, and the object they must be orbiting is around 500 times more massive than the Sun, but we can't see it. And there's only one object in space that fits those criteria, and that's a black hole. So the working hypothesis is that our Centauri, the binary pair that we can see, is in orbit around a black hole. So the scientific findings are really interesting, but for me, and for the purposes today, what's even more important, I think, is the human connection. The fact that work that I did with some of my amateur astronomer colleagues in 2016 and 2019 connect directly to the work of this Scotsman, Alexander Roberts, out in the Veldt in South Africa in the 1890s. And that connection is not only sharing data, but sharing a set of values, sharing some attitudes about the value of the spirit of inquiry and the transformative power of asking questions.
So, colleagues, I'm getting the sense that so far this morning, or this evening if you're in Australia, that we are actually demonstrating this power of connection. It's been wonderful following the tweet stream on social media. Thanks for the shout out, Marsha, and the questions that are coming through in the comments. Bethany, one of my students from Oxford from 30 years ago, was a little rah-rah for Shankiran analysis, and I won't tell you any more about Shankiran analysis. Rachel in Melbourne says it's a pink supermoon in Melbourne. Actually, it's a pink supermoon everywhere in the world. The moon is just upside down up here in the Northern Hemisphere. Linda, it's okay. The rugby comment, you'll get your own back at the end of the lecture. You just watch. I would also love to talk more about black holes. I'm afraid as an amateur astronomer, the maths are beyond me. So we'll just draw a line under it there. What I would like to talk about just briefly is that building. And I talked about it as a disruptive social learning technology. And that wasn't a throwaway line. I want you to think about this. This was an investment in 1883 by Thomas Coates as a public observatory. Astronomy was very sexy then. We were starting to think that we were able to use some tools and instruments to unlock some really important mysteries of the universe. And in fact, the wonderful thing about astronomy is you've got high energy nuclear physics going on just through a telescope, and we can actually look at the fundamental building blocks and principles that put the universe together from there. But the important point for me and for Coates is that this was given to the people of Paisley. This was about changing the social fabric and social structure by connecting people to learning. For me, this is an axiom of teaching and learning faith. It's not about content, it is about connection. So to keep it really current, and those of you from UWS will probably anticipate this announcement, UWS has been trialling a really quite disruptive and new approach to a learning management system, a virtual learning environment called Aula. It's predicated on the basis that learning online is about connecting people, not about transmitting knowledge. And most of our existing technologies for online learning are about connecting, have been about transmitting knowledge. Google's good for that. A learning management system, a virtual learning environment, have to translate from Australian to British here. That environment is about bringing people together, students learning from students, students learning from lecturers, everyone learning from industry. And to the extent that a learning environment can be like a social media technology, that's to the extent that it can actually do that deep, substantial connectiveness and connected learning. So I'm delighted to announce that as of yesterday, after a very robust and highly energetic consultation and procurement process, UWS has signed a 5-year contract with Aula to be its social learning partner. And we are absolutely delighted, if a little anxious, that we are going to be moving forward together as a partnership to do something quite new, not just about shoving our content from our existing learning management system Moodle into Aula, but about working with Aula and their team of expert learning designers to transform our education here at UWS from one that's based on the transmission of knowledge to one that's predicated on people being connected as part of a learning community. That's what we do best at UWS, is build communities, and that's why we need the right tools and the right partner to do the job. So I'll now ask Rachel to start some more slideshow. I've got a little essay into zoology as a metaphor for university management that I needed some footage. I needed some footage from my garden.
I also really like the fact that neither Alexander Roberts or I have any formal qualifications in astronomy. We've both learnt a lot informally. He learnt from mentors in Scotland and in South Africa. I learnt from mentors on the internet, because at the moment the astronomical amateur community happens online. But neither of us have degrees in the subject. But I think that demonstrates a little bit of what I said at the beginning of this talk. For me at least, the core value and purpose of a university education is not about the transmission of knowledge. If I'm really honest, I remember very little about what I learned in lectures as an undergraduate in the 1980s or a graduate in the 1990s. I remember people. but I remember the content much less. I do remember one memorable evening. It was a dinner, in fact, at university. I attended the Liberal Democrat Society dinner at Oxford, and we were addressed by Conrad Russell, the son of Bertrand Russell. Conrad Russell was at that time one of the first Liberal Democrat peers in the House of Lords. And he spoke to us on the topic of liberalism, and he used the metaphor of the fox and the hedgehog, an ancient Greek metaphor. The fox knows a lot of little things, the hedgehog knows one big thing. And it had been written up as an essay by Isaiah Berlin in the 1950s. Russell connected that to political parties, and he said that the strength but also the challenge of the Liberal Party was that Liberals knew lots of little things, whereas socialism, conservatism was about one big thing. And it just reflecting on the current state of yellow-tinged parties in Scotland, I think you can see the contrast between a party that knows lots of little things and another party that stands for one big thing, Scottish independence. And that struck me as a useful way of thinking about universities. I think that universities, the true purpose and spirit of universities is more of a fox. It's reaching across ways of thinking to connect ideas and to solve problems through looking at things from different lights, from different angles. But unfortunately, I think more and more intellectual practice is to be like a hedgehog, to hunker down under a bristling spine of impenetrable jargon and protect our knowledge base. And I think that spells death for intellectual practice and for the future of universities. Now, just a personal note. As an Australian, foxes and hedgehogs are actually legendary creatures. Neither of them is native to Australia. In fact, if I was to give you this talk in Australia, I might talk about dingoes and wombats. I don't know if you're familiar with wombats. They burrow down into their burrows. They're quite muscular and grumpy beasts, and they basically keep to themselves unless someone disturbs them, in which case they get a bit grumpy. Not at all like academics. But when I came to the UK just now, we saw hedgehog food in Tesco, and we were beside ourselves, you know, as if characters from Beatrix Potter or Wind in the Willows had come to life. And so we got some hedgehog food, we got a camera, we put it in the garden, and lo and behold, this is what we saw. Now, I don't know about you, but I know which one my money's on. So that's the story of the star Centauri, or more precisely 2 stars, and in fact 3. The next part of my talk is answering that question about Waltzing Matilda. The 2, or in fact 3 songs that go by the name, or tunes that go by the name, words that go by the name Waltzing Matilda. It might seem as though I'm 16,000 kilometres away from the place to start that story, but in fact not. But to ask ourselves the next part of the question, which is the real Waltzing Matilda, we have to go only about 600 yards down to the Paisley Burns Club, which is where we'll start.
Now, as I ride down to the Paisley Burns Club, I'll talk to you a little bit about the night that Waltzing Matilda came into being. Now, let me stress, this isn't original research of mine. There's been obviously a lot of research into what is Australia's national song. Still quite a lot that's contested, but we're pretty clear about some things. The manuscript that you see on the screen is written by a woman called Christina Macpherson when she met Banjo Paterson. Now, Banjo Paterson is Australia's most famous poet, really the Rabbie Burns of Australia. And I'll play a clip from the National Library of Australia that just describes the origin of this piece.
The key to that lady's identity is here at the National Library in Canberra. It's in this folder, down in the library's music stacks. And have a look at this. This is a handwritten version of Waltzing Matilda. Lyrics by Banjo Paterson, and music by Miss Christina McPherson. It was Christina McPherson who hand-wrote this song sheet. She was the daughter of a Queensland squatter, whose friends included Banjo Patterson. And one night in 1895, Banjo Patterson was staying on the family property when Christina decided to play a lively tune on a zither, which is a kind of small flat harp you play on the table. Banjo saw an opportunity to impress the gathering, and Christina of course, and on the spot penned some lyrics. And after a few days of collaborative brainstorming, Banjo and Christina came up with this. Waltzing Matilda, Matilda, my darling, who'll come on waltzing Matilda with me? Waltzing Matilda, leading our waltzer band, who'll come on waltzing Matilda with me? Sounds a bit different, doesn't it? Robin Holmes is an authority on Waltzing Matilda.
Well, we know from Christina's letters that she actually went to the races and heard a song called Thou Bonnie Wood of Craigielee, Scottish song, being played by the local band in an arrangement by an Australian composer. So the tune obviously stuck in her head as a sort of oral memory, and off she went to Dagworth Station and must have been humming it, and she and Banjo together created the song out of it.
So there you have the story of the origin of Waltzing Matilda. It was written in 1895 by Banjo Patterson, Christina McPherson, and Patterson set the words of the Scottish tune, Thou Bonnie Woods of Craigielee. All good. There's only one big problem. Both Christina McPherson's melody and the original Thou Bonnie Woods of Craigielee bear no relationship whatsoever to what Warren just sang.
So what Warren was seeing there was a version of what's known as the Queensland version of Waltzing Matilda. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda, my darling, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. And without going into the complex rivalries and details between the different versions of the songs, it's fair to say that there are people all over Australia who want to lay claim to the fact that their particular parochial version of Waltzing Matilda is the real one. I'm not going to referee, but use that as an example of what I described earlier as a bit like hedgehog thinking. In a way, if you know one big thing, then it's important that all the evidence that you have at your disposal fits your worldview rather than vice versa. And I'm arguing here for fox-like behaviour, for making connections, looking at things from different angles, different lenses. This is more than, well, actually, Milan has just asked a really interesting question that I don't have time to do justice to here, but I can just touch on about what advice I'd give to early career researchers. And there's a real tension, isn't there, when we're thinking about academic careers, about assembling your demonstrated body of knowledge in which you are the expert, as opposed to what I think everyone is recognising, and you see this playing out in REF, that's ERA for Australians, and a drive, I think, in the opposite direction to coming up with research that allows people to make connections from multiple perspectives. This is more than just me saying in fancy words that interdisciplinarity is nice. And I think we've got a classic example right here, right now in COVID. There are a group of economists who are analysing, I'm just going to watch it, analysing the fact, sorry, we've just got to track it back to reverse over my camera, the hazards of live broadcasting. On the one hand, we have an economic view based on really good economic research that says lockdown is destroying our economies, and that's right. Over the other hand, we've got public health and health management saying that lockdown is keeping people alive, and that's right. There's no question that both perspectives are accurate. What we perhaps are lacking a little bit is the ability to find some ground to mediate between different perspectives. You just have to look at the violence that we saw in the US as part of the presidential transition, as an example of hedgehogs in mortal combat, two views of the world that are irreconcilable. But when it comes to vaccine denial or climate skepticism, or dare I say it, Brexit, you can see the damage that is done by the inability to look at things from multiple perspectives, shift your view on the basis of the evidence, be content to know a lot of little things. So in answer to Milan's question, and I think there's an interesting thing to explore, it's really important for an early career academic to know not only do you need to be an expert in the knowledge base of your discipline, and from that comes the confidence to do the sort of thing I'm talking about. I'm not dismissing it in any way, shape or form, but absolutely imperative to become an expert at connecting that knowledge base with other worldviews, with other ways of understanding value, with other perspectives and frames of reference. I'm in danger of staying on my soapbox too long. I'll get off my soapbox and back on my motorbike. And let's get back to that question, that innocent question about which is the real Waltzing Matilda. So Rebecca, if you could play the slides, thanks.
So this is the house of Scottish poet Robert Tannahill. Tannahill lived from about 1774 to 1810, very short and tragic life. Tannahill actually founded one of the very first Burns clubs or Burns societies in 1805 in this house. He lived here all his life. Now Tannahill was a very accomplished poet in his own right, but in his own time not well recognised, and there's a sad story about that. It's interesting, Tannahill was one of the first people to almost bring Burns to sort of status of veneration, and this was a bit of a 19th century phenomenon in the arts. If you think about Coleridge or Lamb and Shakespeare in the 19th century, or if you think about Mendelssohn's revival of Bach, there was this movement in the 19th century to place artistic genius on a pedestal that put it beyond the human, and I think there's a little bit of that going on here, but I should resist the temptation for a music history lecture. The music of Thou Bonny Woods of Craigie Lee was written by a local Glasgow composer, James Barr, in 1808, a setting of a poem of his friend Robert Tannahill, Thou Bonny Woods of Craigie Lee. And so the origin, the beginning, the spark that led eventually to the song we all sing at every public event in Australia started right here. So we're getting very close to the end. Just one more stop on the trip. I'd like us, before we finish, to find the Bonny Woods of Craigie Lee. And as I drive, I think I'll sing you a little bit of the song. Now, I was going to team up with Head of Creative Industries, Davey Scott, who was going to sing the Scottish song and I was going to sing the Australian song, but Davey has unfortunately lost his voice. Either that or he's ascribing to the old adage of performers never work with children, animals or pro-vice chancellors. Probably quite wise. So I've had to prepare something earlier, which I'll play for you as I go across. But just a postscript to Robert Tannahill as we go. And those of you who know all the verses of Waltzing Matilda will recognise this instantly. Tannahill had an unhappy life, plagued seemingly by depression and anxiety. He did not have a lot of success as a poet, and eventually in 1810, when he was only 35 years old, he had another rejection from a publisher in Edinburgh, and he took his own life. The Paisley Canal was just about to open, just down the road there, and there was a culvert built under the canal with a very deep body of water, and he threw himself in and drowned himself. A really poetic irony when you think about how Waltzing Matilda finishes.
So let's listen to these two songs. The chorus of The Bonny Wood of Craigie Lee and of the Waltzing Matilda we know are quite similar. The bonny wood of Craigie Lee, the bonny wood of Craigie Lee. Waltzing Matilda, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. The problem is the chorus I just sang wasn't what Christina McPherson wrote when she was with Banjo Patterson in 1895. That was written later in about 1903 by a woman called Marie Cowan, who was hired by the Billy Tea Company to do a bit of product placement in the song. Actually, remembering that Christina McPherson was writing this from memory, when it came to the chorus that she wrote down back in 1895, her recollection of the Bonny Woods of Craigie Lee that she'd heard a couple of months before at Warrnambool was getting a bit hazy, and the chorus she wrote meandered. But the verse is nearly identical. The broom, the briar, the birken bush, bloom bonny, O thou flowery lea. And he sang as he watched and waited till it's absolutely identical. So, just thinking about the tragic end of Robert Tannehill, I'll sing the last verse of Waltzing Matilda as it was written down that January night in 1895 by Christina McPherson and Banjo Patterson. Is it the real version? Well, it's certainly the first version, and it certainly started life in Paisley. But the swagman he upped and jumped into the billabong, drowning himself by the coolabah tree. And his ghost may be heard singing by the billabong. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? So here we are at the end of our journey, and here they are, nestled underneath the disused gasworks and next to the Flying Scot Airport parking. And in the shadows of the august and distinguished St Mirren football ground are what is left of the bonny woods of Craigie-Lee. It's really quite sad. Tannehill's poem paints a picture of a sylvan idyll, and while most of my time scooting around Paisley has been really brimming with optimism about exactly what we can do if we only connect, I fear that we're ending now on a note of pessimism of what happens if we don't tend our intellectual garden. So, in conclusion, colleagues, what do I want you to leave with? Only connect. Remember, first and foremost, that teaching is a human activity. Learning is a connection with the other. I can't remember what I learned as an undergraduate, not the content. I can remember the teachers, and I want to finish with a very personal tribute. I've had some inspiring teachers, and I'm sure you have each are where you are because of the inspirational teachers that you worked with in your lives. Too many to name. The first lecture I ever had at university was given by one of my most inspirational teachers, Professor Peter Platt. We all called him Prof. I wanted to be Prof when I grew up, and I've done a reasonable job. Peter Platt wrote a few articles in his life, but the most important one for me was an article called Only Connect. And in it, he argued from a musical perspective for many of the same values and attitudes that I've shared with you today. And I'm sure he would have enjoyed today's lecture. And though he died 21 years ago, I'd like to dedicate it to his memory.
So, friends and colleagues, we've reached the end. And Lucy asked a question about what advice I might give to teachers at UWS, and that was indeed how I was going to finish. But before I do that, I've got a couple of important sporting announcements. I think I might have been slightly caustic in my description of the St Mirren football pitch. After last night's performance, I take it all back. In fact, I want to make the announcement I want to make this morning. People have been asking me since I arrived in Glasgow, Rangers or Celtic? Well, I'm going to say that after last night, St Mirren. Australians, you're probably baffled, but St Mirren had a triumphant last-minute victory in the Scottish Cup last night over Kilmarnock. Last-minute equaliser in extra time, penalty shootout, and victory. St Mirren is the football pitch closest to the Paisley campus of the University of Western Scotland. My heart belongs to Hamilton Academicals in some way, just because of the name. The other important sporting announcement is this, and this picks up on a comment Linda Aitken made in the chat about rugby. Look, it's true that Australia probably has the edge over Scotland in the battles between the two teams. Although the Scots have done pretty well at Murrayfield recently. One day we will be back, and I will be there in the stands at Murrayfield, and you may even catch me singing Flower of Scotland. But there will be 10,000, eventually, 10,000 green and gold clad crazy Australians singing Waltzing Matilda. And just think to yourself, whatever the score, that they're singing a Scottish song. So, to conclude, what advice would I give to the UWS teaching community stemming from today's thinking, stemming from the notion of only connect? It's all about people. They will not remember your content. Your students will not remember your content, and nor should they. They're not in there for your content. They are there for their futures. They will remember you. So don't be shy about bringing yourself into your teaching. I'm terribly upset about what I see a trend to be to reduce the teaching and learning process. The notion of excellent teaching and learning to be something about the transmission of material. It's not. It's about connecting with a human being. Don't be shy about that. Remember that they're people and they are in your class because they are thinking to transform themselves, get a job, change a job, improve their understanding about something. I'm not talking about mere instrumental and expedient skill development. Some of them are about transforming their attitudes and values fundamentally, but don't shy away from the fact that what you're designing is that journey for them. As a researcher, and I think it's absolutely essential to connect the spirit of research and inquiry to teaching. That is the only distinguishing feature of universities. And I remember Malcolm Gillies, who's here today, gave an outstanding reminder of that some years back at ANU. The only reason, way in which universities are different from other types of education providers, is that we build our education around that spirit of inquiry. But be inquiry-led, not publication-led. They are different things. Research is about questioning. Research is not about writing papers based on what you already know. And there is a tension here, I will admit, in the way in which we evaluate and recognize research. But I think that the winds of change are shifting around there. And the more we talk about impact, the more we talk about research engagement, the more the emphasis gets placed on some of the outstanding things that UWS does around knowledge transfer. I think the better we are placed as a university and the better the society is placed, because we become more like foxes and less like hedgehogs. I think I'm going to leave it there, Craig, and pass back to you, because I think we've got a few minutes for questions now.
Thanks, Jonathan. You'll get to look at the detailed comments in the privacy later of your own time. There's been some great comments coming through, as I might have expected and as you will expect. And I think you've delivered an outstanding inaugural lecture demonstrating, as you and I have often chatted about, the ways in which learning is not about the passage of knowledge. And I think you've demonstrated really nicely today with your own physical trip around Paisley, along with some predetermined information that you recorded in the way that we know that virtual learning environments can be used quite creatively. You've answered one of the questions, which was Lucy's question about early career academics and what they might need to be thinking about in their preparation, because what you've done today could be quite frightening. You're a little bit more experienced than an early career researcher who might look at this and think, wow, if that's what they expect of me, I'm not sure I can do that. But let me reverse the question for a minute and go on to the student body as well. Ken posed a really good question around students and asked whether or not we think that they are coming to university prepared enough to be able to make the connections that you've referred to if we were to take a less than traditional learning model and pedagogic model for the delivery of what people think is learning. And I just wonder where you think UWS might be in that journey. Do we have students who could cope with the connected type of learning that you and I so strongly believe in?
My answer to that, Craig, is yes. I think in my career, if I've learned one thing, it's that we underestimate the capability of our students. Now, I don't think that they necessarily can do it without help. And that's been my theme. I think standing at their side, filling the gaps, putting the virtual reassuring hand on the shoulder is actually more important than standing in front of them and telling them what they don't know. So I do believe that the answer is yes. And I'll go further, Craig. I think that many of our students are coming into, particularly the younger ones, I don't want to generalize here, have many of the skills to use the digital technologies to make connections across disciplines, across the globe, across ways of knowing, more comfortably than perhaps some of we old greybeards. So I think we would underestimate that capability. But as you said, Craig, you're actually flipping the same question around our teachers, around our younger teachers. And my absolute advice to the teachers is, do not do this on your own. I actually think that this is a metaphor for the journey that UWS is about to take in its teaching. We've got quite an isolationist model of how we do our teaching. Individual module coordinators, by and large, being responsible for almost everything that happens in their modules. I think we're going to have to get used to working together, relying on other people for the skills that we might not have, making sure that working a lot closely with our colleagues, we deliver a very seamless and joined up digital experience for students. Because coming back to Richard's question, of course, if what the students get is chaotic and unpredictable and inconsistent and different from every teacher, then it's going to be much harder than if there is a single path that they go on down this more deep and rich learning. So, you know, I think my answer is, Craig, is together we can do this.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think we need to be positive and believe that things can be achieved, and so that's the basis on which we remain in education. Lots of people inspired by your presentation today, Jonathan. Uplifted, people referring to it not as a lecture but a journey. A lot of local people who enjoyed the history that you brought into the lecture. But let's go to Richard Davidson's question, and he's asking, have you got any thoughts on the concept of developing a second brain?
Well, Craig, my first response is to say, yeah, rip your bloody arms off and reuse the biological material. But I suspect only you and I will know what the hell I'm talking about. Actually, look, just to explain that to both the British audience and the younger Australians, rip your bloody arms off was the catchphrase of a hairy transvestite biker entertainer in Australia called Auntie Jack, who was a real surrealist comedy. And Craig and I often use Auntie Jack as a bit of a metaphor for change management at the University of Western Scotland. No, I mean, in all seriousness, I think we are asked, what Richard's question is quietly saying is, we're going to be asking our teachers to do different things from what they did previously, and that can be frightening and challenging. I think it's really important that our approach to developing our digital capability is supportive, empowering. Look, the last thing I'm going to be doing as Vice Principal Learning, Teaching and Students is wandering around and saying, you need to teach like Jonathan. I want you to find your own ways, or as program teams to find your own ways of really enriching that student experience. And I'm here to support you. And as someone who is relatively experienced in how we do this, to be a guide on the side and provide that support. And Ella is going to provide a lot of that support as well. The last thing, I mean, a few comments about the technology. Look, you know, this whole lecture this morning was done with cutting edge learning technology. There's the camera app on your iPhone, and you know, how to do it is there's a big red button and you just press that button. So that's how it happens. It really is as simple as that. Much more important, the technology, what I'm trying to say here is that the technology is not the important thing. The important thing is the design thinking. I wanted to connect the international audience here today with Paisley, and I also wanted to show something about the fact that the flexibilities of place that come with online delivery or online learning extend to the teacher as well as to the student. I think I've done a reasonable fist of that. What I haven't been trying to do is to make a documentary with a highly expensive BBC production crew. And so I'm actually quite pleased that it's been a bit funky. The production has been a bit as though it was cobbled together on an iPhone over the weekend, because it was. That's okay.
Jonathan, I commented before about the fear that some academics might have about trying to emulate this, but there are a lot of positive comments coming through here saying, want to try this, want to bring some of my own personality and my own experiences into lectures and teaching in future. A comment's being made about the use of educational technologists, and then later on the question is, where do you find educational technologists? I know you've got an answer to that because we've just employed a company, so I'm going to hand that back to you. Where do we find our educational technologists to help us with some of this stuff?
Well, you sort of answered the question. The first thing to say is, as it happens, my wife, who's standing 3 feet away, is in fact an educational technologist, and she was a bit trepidatious coming to Scotland. you know, if you're going to get a job. And I said, come on, you're working in the most employable profession. Since the pandemic, educational technologists are the most sought after people on the planet. And they are. She starts work at the University of Strathclyde next week, but I'm still speaking to her. Where do you find the educational technologists? Well, I think in Australia we call them educational designers, and they do the same thing. And I'd actually want to use that language because, as I just said around the iPhone, the technology isn't the key issue. The key issue is the design, and that starts with who are my students and how am I going to change them as people as a result of this learning activity. Now, that sounds ambitious, but it actually is quite meaningful. If you go into a process of teaching or designing a learning activity, and if you say, what am I going to tell them? You're starting wrongly. You need to say, who are they? Where do they want to be in 5 years' time? Where do they want to be tomorrow? What can't they do now that they need to be able to do? Where are they lacking in confidence because of their previous experience? And that answers your question about readiness. Some of our students, it's not about experience, it's confidence. If you go in with that design mentality, and a specialist education designer can really help you there, then you'll be much more successful. We will get that design support from ALA. That's what they're coming to do. We also have some technologists and designers in education futures, but not enough. We really need to fine tune how those two bodies of expertise are going to work together. But frankly, Craig, and I'll finish with this, the best education designers, the best education thinkers I've met at the University of Western Scotland are out in the schools as academics. We have an extraordinary wealth of talent, and that's been really clear to me since I've arrived. We're better placed around student-centered learning than any other university I've been at, without question. I think we need to be better at working together. I think we need to be better at being bold. But in terms of our teaching and learning will, and we're talking a lot about values and attitudes, the values and attitudes around supporting our students that I've met at UWS has been just outstanding, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's why I'm here. Because of the culture of this institution that is here for its students. And that's more than empty rhetoric, it's absolutely powerful. That has got to be the right starting point. And what I would say to people wondering where they get education design support is trust yourself to connect as a human being to these people who are learning. Remember your own experience as a student, and that we are here for you.
Jonathan, we're getting close to running out of time, but I do want to pose a couple more things to you just before we go. So if people are willing to stay, we'll just stay on for a few more minutes. We know the past year has been really difficult for everybody. Certainly staff working in the university have had a very difficult, stressful time having to shift over to a different way of supporting whatever job they had in the university, but it's been tough for students as well. And they've missed out on the opportunity for connections and the extracurricular experience. So good question from Kieran O'Brien, who heads up our sport. Where learning is about making connections and following the journey, what's your view on the role of the wider student experience, sport, music, societies, support services, etc., on creating or supporting the environment?
What a good question. What a lovely question. And if I may share what happened in a confidential situation during my interview, Craig, you asked the last question. You said, Jonathan, if you got this job, would you be prepared to start a choir at the University of West of Scotland? And I think it was at that point that I said, oh, I'm coming. Not just because I want to start a choir, but because it speaks to the notion of community. So to answer Kieran's question, it's absolutely central. And probably from what I've been saying today, I don't regard the notion of sport, of well-being, of connecting as socially as well as academically. I don't regard that as extracurricular. I actually regard that as part of the core university experience. It really is about transforming yourself as a whole person. I remember at Liverpool Hope, where I started my academic career, we adopted the institutional maxim where you need to educate the whole person. And I really loved that. John Bennett is here from Liverpool Hope, and I don't know if that's still the philosophy, but it certainly became part of my philosophy. So Kieran, yeah, I think this could be, not only is this central to educational thinking, making students part of that broader holistic learning experience, I also think it's something that UWS can do better than anyone. And so I look forward to working with you and others, connecting sport, connecting music, connecting the social and even political activities of students as core parts of their learning, not marginal.
Jonathan, there's lots of comments coming through. Josh Pinar says he remembers some of that for his next interview. Josh, great to see you and hear that you're here. Malcolm Gillies, great to know you're here as well, and the other Australian colleagues who have joined us today. Somebody's posted 10 facts about wombats, but one of the facts about wombats you probably won't...
Mitch Parks.
That's it. One of the things you won't be aware of about wombats is that Julie Walkling, a former colleague of ours, and she's online today, was part of a group in America which had the acronym WOMBATS, Women on Bikes at Tea Parties or something. I can't recall the exact detail of it. It's too far back in the thread. But clearly wombats come up in people's minds a number of times. I'm going to wrap it up, but can I just remind everybody that this has been an outstanding inaugural lecture, an inaugural talk, whatever you want to call it, but a journey. And we've appreciated the journey that you've taken us through, Jonathan, in terms of Paisley, the University of the West of Scotland, its predecessors, bringing in the Australian roots around a very famous song in Waltzing Matilda, your connections to music across that journey. And remembering, as our corporate strategy says, that we're here for our students, but we dare to be different. And you've done the dare to be different bit today very well. The technologies thankfully worked exceptionally well, because that hasn't always been the case, but you've pulled it off. And I think one of the strong endorsements from our court, we've got a number of court members here today, and it was very interesting for me to read the comment from Andrew Gordon, the former president of the Student Union at Aberdeen University just a few years back, but now a member of our court. And he says that when he was a student, he attended a lecture which started before 10 o'clock only once. So he's pleased that he's now doubled that record. He said this was really interesting and enjoyable. You'll read these comments later. Someone will save them for you. It's been a wonderful journey, Jonathan. Can I thank you so much for your time and your effort in preparing this and putting it together. And this is something which we've recorded, so it's there for in perpetuity. We're going to enjoy looking at this back again and again and again. And we all look forward to working with you over the time that you spend at UWS. Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. It's been an absolute delight.
Thanks, everybody.